Hi, Bill Boggs here. Good morning to you. We have a very special guest in our program today, and I think an interesting show for you, both from the standpoint of the history of the Middle East, as well as an analysis of a very important man's point of view on what's happening there right now. The important man is Yitzhak Rabin, former Prime Minister of Israel. He'll be with us in just a couple of moments. He also was the ambassador to the United States from Israel, and he was also the chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Forces for many years, and the architect of some of the brilliant strategy that went into the now historic Six-Day War. I want to talk to him. I actually think we'll start out by talking to him about the Six-Day War and some of the plans and some of the specific things that went into that being such a stunning military victory. Later in the show, for 2 segments at the end of the program, we have a gentleman who is a representative of the PLO, actually a PLO observer at the United Nations. Obviously, the two men would not appear together. We're going to interview Mr. Prime Minister Rabin, and then we're going to put a tape on at the end of the program of an interview that I did with the PLO observer yesterday. The man from the PLO will not have seen what you're going to see, and vice versa. At any rate, I ask you please on this particularly important day to stay with us and meet a man who has been involved in making history in one of the most fascinating areas in the world today, in the Middle East. Yitzhak Rabin is our special guest right after this. Well, I'd like to formally welcome to our program the former Prime Minister of the State of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I should just remind you that Prime Minister Rabin was also a Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Forces for many years, as well as Ambassador to the United States for 5 years, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Now the author of a book which I found fascinating, a very important part of any historical library on the Middle East or otherwise, the Rabin Memoirs, written in about 1.5 years of your own time by yourself.
Yeah.
So many people who write memoirs really have someone else write the memoirs for them, not you. You know what I would like to talk about? Just a little bit on, you were born in Jerusalem. How your parents, your mother and father, came to be there, their motives, and what took them to that land?
Well, both of them were born in Russia, but they came in entirely different ways. My father grew up in Ukraine, near the capital of it, Kiev, but in 1904 there was real tension there. Pogrom started against Jews, and he managed to get out of Russia, to come over to the United States. He came to this country in 1904. He was about 18 years old, 17, 18 years old, started to find his ways in the new world.
What were his skills at this time?
He practically had no skills whatsoever. He started to study, to maintain himself. He sold papers. Later on, he became tailor.
A tailor? Where did he live in the United States?
He lived mainly in Chicago, for some years in St. Louis. And in 1917, when the Balfour Declaration was given by the British government then, that called for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, and the British government called for American volunteers to join the British Army within the framework of the Jewish Legion that was supposed and really later on fought for the liberation of Palestine from the Ottoman Empire. My father was among 1,600 American Jews who volunteered to serve as soldiers within the Jewish Legion, and he came to Palestine as a British soldier in 1918.
So he was still a very young man.
Yeah, he decided then...
Why did he make that decision, by the way? What was there about his father, your grandfather, or the history of your family that would motivate your father at such a young age to leave?
No, I believe that when he came to the United States, learned what is the real meaning of democracy, got better education, was involved in Jewish life here in Chicago, in St. Louis. He became a Zionist, and when the opportunity and the challenge faced him, he took it.
He welcomed it.
He welcomed it, and he decided to volunteer to serve in the British Army in the Jewish Legion, and came over to Palestine and of course decided to stay. My mother grew up in an entirely different environment. Her father was a very rich merchant. He had a permission by the Tsar, which most of the Jews didn't have, to live in Petrograd, what is now Leningrad. And she was educated as an engineer. She worked during the war in an ammunition factory. She was a socialist but not communist. When the communists took over in 1917, she realized that the Soviet Union would not be the place for her to live. And in 1919, when the first opportunity was offered to her, and the first ship, after the end of the First World War, left Odessa, the Russian city port on the Black Sea, to Palestine, she joined the people who came with this ship. She came over, she had relatives in Palestine those days, and it happened that this is the way that both arrived to Palestine, my father in 1918, my mother in 1919. It happened that both met in 1920, when the first time the Arab community used force against the Jewish community, especially in Jerusalem. The Jewish quarter in the old city was under very severe attack. My mother rushed there to serve as a nurse. My father, with many of those who served in the Jewish Legion, joined the defenders of the Jewish quarter of the old city. The attacks were repulsed, and my mother and my father met, and this is how 2 years later I was born.
As you were growing up, the historical factors, the factors of tension, the factors of persecution, the factors of Zionism were right there in your household. What were some of the very early, really early, when you were a very young 3, 4, 5, 6-year-old little boy, that you remember absorbing from your parents that obviously led to your becoming the kind of man you became in the history of Israel?
Well, I can't say that then I assumed that I'll play.
No, that's not what I meant, but it must have been a basic thing that you got from your parents at an early age.
I believe that Jewishness, Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, the idea that we are there, the Zionist ideas, came to me naturally.
Mm-hmm.
There was no need for special preaching or special teaching. It came to me as a result of the way that my father and my mother came to the country, the way that they acted, the way they behaved, the whole environment within which I grew up, lived. As a kid, of course, we talked only Hebrew. We studied Bible. For us, the Bible was something which was not just a religious book. To me, it was more the history of the values and what happened to the Jewish people when they were a Jewish independent sovereign state. Mm-hmm. Wherever I went in Israel, it was a name from the Bible. Not only the place where I was born, Jerusalem, but when I was a kid and in the schools, we used to travel, to walk. Every place, every mountain had a meaning which was deeply rooted in our history of 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. At the same time, new meanings of something which is built, something which has to be achieved, something that we would like to achieve.
So in the past 30 years in the history of Israel, 30 few years, there's been unbelievable progress in terms of making this dream, an early dream of you and of your parents, a reality. because life has changed so much there and so much has grown, do you ever find yourself worrying about the next generation, the young kids, because they haven't gone through what you went through and because they haven't gone through what your parents went through to create the basis of this dream?
Well, I believe generally everywhere in this world, every generation believes that the coming generation is less good as the generation to which they belong. I don't believe this is the case when it comes to Israel. Of course, no one can experience what former generation experienced. But the basic question is, to what extent they are determined, they are dedicated.
Determination, that's correct, yes.
They are dedicated to continue to what has started. It might be in their own way. It might be sometimes we don't like certain way of behaviors, but we have to bear in mind that life is something which is changing all the time. And therefore, we have to look at the essence of what every generation brings with it, not about certain habits, certain different modes, sometimes even different values when it comes to not the most important parts of life. I think we are very proud of our young generation.
Have you ever seen the American musical Fiddler on the Roof?
Yes, I've seen it.
I'm just wondering how you would apply the word tradition as it was represented in the conflict between the young generation and the old generation in Fiddler on the Roof to what you had just said about Israel and life there today.
If you look at tradition in terms of its external facets, I don't believe that it exists. It's not the same way of dressing. Mm-hmm. It's not the same way of haircut. It's not the same way of certain external appearances of the tradition. But if you look at the essence of tradition, values, the place of the family, the respect for parents, understanding of certain Jewish values, keeping certain Jewish symbols like holidays, the way that holidays are celebrated. The tradition is there, but might be in a more modern appearance.
Well answered. I have to take a break for a commercial. That's one of our traditions on the show, and we'll be back right after this continue. Welcome back. A couple of things on peace and defense and the intertwinement of the two. First, just a general question, almost as a global picture. The bulk of your career was spent in defense as chief of staff, the Israeli defense service. In the military service.
27 years.
27 years in military service. So with that as a basis, looking at the globe, what kind of situation can you envision where atomic weapons might be used in the next couple of years? I think this is one of the major fears that people have in the back of their mind. It hasn't been for a long time. More countries have them than ever before. The thought of atomic terrorism, it's a horrible thought. What kind of circumstances could perpetuate the use of atomic weapons?
Well, I don't believe that it's applicable nowadays to the Middle East. If you talk in terms of other places in this world, of course there is a danger.
Where do you think the most dangerous area of the globe is?
Well, I believe that the real problem is to what extent the United States and the Soviet Union will succeed to prevent any escalation of tensions anywhere in the world to the extent that they'll have to use nuclear weapons between themselves. The same might apply also to the interrelations between China and the Soviet Union. Today, I think the dangers of nuclear war is only as a result of confrontation, military confrontation, between the major powers. I tend to believe that the dangers have reduced, and today I think there is a realization on the part of the major powers that the turn to the nuclear weapon means total destruction.
Yes.
But after all, military wars are guided by political considerations, and they are conducted for the sake of winning them. There will be no winner in any nuclear war anywhere in the world.
As you view the insanity of that, the very fact of the existence of the kind of nuclear weapons we have, is it not also equally insane that both the United States and Russia are spending such an enormous amounts of our national budgets to continue the growth and development of such weapons of mutual destruction? How can that be curbed and stopped?
Well, I think that you have to look to the reasons for that in the basic confrontation between two concepts of life, between two major powers' interests. And as long as there will be such a confrontation, suspicion, the only way to live peacefully is one that has to be able to neutralize the other one. This is the story of the period of the last almost 30 years, when there is a balance of terror in the interrelations between the major powers.
I believe that we have hit that balance right now for certain. What can we do to keep ourselves at a balance and not continue to spend more and more money just escalating the balance?
I believe that this is the purpose of the SALT talks and the SALT agreements. It's not an agreement that its purpose is to get rid of the nuclear weapons, but to keep certain balance that will reduce the price tag for both powers.
I'd now like to turn the clock back to your role with regard to the Six-Day War. In reading, this to me was the most interesting part of your book. I found it fascinating. I'd like to talk a little bit about the strategy that you formulated to control the skies and the incredible one day where the Israeli Air Force did something, in the whole entire history of warfare, it has to be one of the leading accomplishments. Can you just talk generally about that, the philosophy behind what it would take to get the Israeli Air Force to do what they did, and why?
Well, the basic philosophy of Israel was not to initiate war unless an act of war was carried out against us. We then lived within the lines that existed prior to the Six-Day War, lines that gave no depth to Israel, and therefore Israel was in a need, whenever there would be a war, to go immediately on the offensive, to carry the war to the enemy's land. The kind of warfare that Israel had to conduct then was offensive mobile warfare on the ground, to be used mainly by armored forces. But to achieve decisive results, you have to have air supremacy. And therefore the main purpose was to prepare the Air Force to gain air supremacy in the most decisive way. For that, we build a type of planes that can be used as fighter and bombers at the same time. Their ranges in the Middle East are limited. Second, we developed a system of armament by which we first are dependent on longer
runways, yes.
And once you put the runway out of action, the plane, the most sophisticated one, is a sitting duck. Third, therefore, to neutralize the whole control system, and of course then to destroy the planes. The problem was how to reach the air bases with maximum of tactical surprise. For that we trained our pilots to fly very low.
How low, actually?
Oh, they flew over the sea, I would say, about 30 to 50 feet above sea level, with
Almost like a
supersonic...
flying boat.
Almost.
Yes.
Almost hovering over the sea rather than flying. We built model of every type of Egyptian, Syrian, Jordanian air bases in the Negev, and our pilots were trained where to hit the runways. What are the points that once you hit 3, 4 points by two, three bombs, the runway is out of action, or the complex of runways are out of action. We trained ourselves time and again for such eventuality. We found that when the war started, it was after 3 weeks of tension.
Yes.
All the Arab countries' armed forces were on the alert. First, they carried out an act of war. Second, they concentrated all their forces around the Israeli lines. 3, they put all their air forces on the alert. We knew that there would be no strategic surprise whatsoever. And therefore, we found that unless in 3 hours, in 3 waves that will call for most of our planes.
That was the incredible thing to me, excuse me for interrupting, that at one point there were only 12 planes left in Israel. An incredible statistic if you stop and analyze.
We had 200 planes vis-a-vis, I would say, about 500 planes of the total strength of the Arab countries' air forces. And we realized that unless we first put out Egypt from any capability to use its air force, the war is going to be prolonged and costly. Therefore, we sent out of the 200 planes 188 in 3 waves, 3 hours, all of them over Egypt. And we kept 12 planes to defend Israel from Syria, Jordan, and Iraq, that their combined air force mounted for at least 150 planes.
But there was no counteract during those crucial hours, was there?
The risk was calculated very carefully. We assumed that it would take the Egyptian high command to learn what happened, to reach conclusions, to turn to the other Arab countries, to use their air forces to attack Israel more than 3 hours. In fact, it took 4.5 hours. When we were attacked by the Iraqis, the Syrians, and the Jordanians' air forces, it was 4.5 hours after we started our attack.
And at that point, how many planes had returned?
At that point, most of the planes of the first and the second wave were back and ready for battle. Therefore, it didn't take us more than 3 hours more to finish the Syrian, the Jordanian, and the advanced airbase of Iraq, from which they could send planes to attack Israel, except, of course, the bombers, but the bombers were subsonic, therefore they didn't present any threat to Israel. The success of Israel, the Israeli Air Force, in the first 3 hours, really to finish the Egyptian Air Force as a fighting machine, and later on the same day, to do the same for all the other Arab countries' air forces, gave us the capability to win the war
really
quickly,
yes,
and relatively without so many casualties.
There's a very interesting historical footnote in your book following this first day of the 3 waves of attacks you just described when Nasser phoned King Hussein with what allegations as to the principles involved in this one great attack that Israel made?
No, because it came as a total surprise to Nasser. Because according to their system, they kept over 50% of their fighter bombers for the air defense. And he realized that here came almost 200 planes. He didn't believe that Israel would dare to do what we did. And he therefore assumed that since Israel doesn't have so many planes, somebody else had participated in this attack. And he accused the United States that the Sixth Fleet
told Hussein that the United States.
And which, of course, total nonsense.
Total nonsense. We're going to take a pause. When we come back, I'd like to show some of the great collection of historical photographs from your book right after this. We're back. We were talking with Yitzhak Rabin. His book is the Rabin Memoirs, and there are some interesting photographs in this, and I'd just like to go through a few of them. And stream of consciousness, tell us what your thoughts are about why you included these particular photographs in your memoirs. I just watched the monitor right here. Is this one of your favorite photographs of you?
Well, I believe this was the official photograph of me
when you were
when I was a prime minister.
Prime minister. Okay. Well.
This was a talk between myself and Ben-Gurion after the Six-Day War was won. He had different opinion prior to the war, and he felt that he had to do something with me, and we met, and it was a very interesting and warm meeting. Well, in a way, the entrance of Dayan, who was the defense minister, myself.
You were the chief of staff.
Myself as the chief of staff of the armed forces,
right.
And the third one, the general who commanded the central command, it was in Arkis, to the old city. It represented the unification of the city of Jerusalem.
Yes, you have a marvelous description in the book of going to the Western Wall. Now here we are in a totally different situation. This is when you're ambassador.
No, this was when I was prime minister, visiting with President Ford. I believe it's September '74.
Here we are, it's all right.
This was during the period of the shuttle diplomacy of Dr. Kissinger. It was in March '75. And I was visiting with the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces, General Gur, the Mitle Pass. This is my sister, my father, and myself when I was quite young. I would say it was 1942. This is my mother when my sister was about 3 and I was 6. This is when I was an ambassador to the United States. The president of Israel, Shazar, was visiting with President Nixon. When I served as ambassador, Yigal Amir was the prime minister, was visiting the White House with Kissinger and my wife.
And I think we have one more here.
This is Joe Sisko, who was the Assistant Secretary of State, good friend of mine.
Thank you for taking us on that little journey. Getting back to the present day, what do you think the United States should do with regard to our enormous dependence on the import of foreign oil?
Well, to what extent the United States in the long run can rely on the fact that it's going to be more and more dependent on flow of oil from the outside, strategically and financially, it's not up to me to say.
No, I understand.
To what extent the United States can allow this situation to be prolonged 10, 20 years, it's one of the major problems that the United States will face in the future. But when it comes for the foreseeable future, let's say 5 years,
fine.
I believe that there are basic 2 approaches here. How to make sure that the sources of oil will be secured. There is one way that was adopted by former administrations, was continued to a certain extent by the present administration, is to try to bring about stable, viable, durable peace to the area. And this can be done only when the United States leads the process and sees in Egypt and Israel the two cornerstones for the peacemaking process, trying to bring into the process more pro-Western Arab countries like Jordan, and standing firm against the radical leftist Arab countries, and no doubt against terrorist organizations like the PLO. I don't believe that one has to be specialist about international relations after seeing Mr. Arafat in the front line of the guest of honors when Brezhnev came to East Germany to deliver his famous speech just 2 months ago. And to tell the Saudis, who are fearful because they are the richest country but the weakest regime, not to try to appease radicals, terrorists, and not as a result to try to appease them, to put pressure on the United States to deviate from the course of peace on which Egypt, Israel, and the United States agreed on at Camp David summit meeting and signed the framework agreement for peace in the Middle East.
Mr. Prime Minister, what is the value of not, underline, not having a dialogue with representatives of the Palestinians?
I believe that we maintain dialogue with the Palestinians on daily basis for 12 years with the people who reside in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Under my government, there were free elections in April '76, and we did not interfere when supporters of the PLO were elected to be mayors, as long as they were not part of the PLO officially, as long as they did not participate in sabotage activities, terrorist activities. We didn't interfere. Karim Khalef, the mayor of Ramallah, and Kawasma, the mayor of Hebron, speak daily against Israel. As long as they only speak, we have nothing against it. But the basic question is how to solve the complicated complex of issues eastward of Israel that include solution to the Palestinian problem, the future of the West Bank, what will happen in Jerusalem. I believe that the best way is to see in Jordan the partner for the negotiations. Jordan today is composed of more than, about half of its population of Palestinians of after 1948. Today, all the residents in the West Bank are Jordanian citizens. No one of them has given up his Jordanian citizenship. Jordan, the leadership of the Palestinians who reside in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, should form a negotiating team to negotiate with Israel all the complex of issues that has to be solved. I would like to see east of Israel, Jordanian Palestinians living in peace with Israel. For that, the Labour Party that I belong to,
yes,
we are today in the opposition to the present government of Israel. When I was Prime Minister, I was ready to give back considerable parts, not all, of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to Jordan and to the leadership of the Palestinians of the West Bank in a context of a real peace.
Then I'd like to ask a very quick hypothetical question. Were you to still be Prime Minister of Israel, with the Camp David Accord having been in the past, would you say that we would be further along the road toward peace than we are right now, with Menachem Begin in control?
I would like to be fair. I think that Mr. Begin, as a Prime Minister, took a major positive decision. People now tend to forget that Mr. Begin made very painful concessions that very few believed that he would give for the achievement of peace with Egypt, for the possibility to sign the framework agreement for peace in the Middle East, to give back the whole Sinai, to agree to uproot every element of Israeli presence in the Sinai. This month, we are going to give back the oil fields that supply today 25% of Israel needs. Can you give me an example of any one country in this world that will give up control of oil fields that supply so much of its own needs for the sake of hope of peace?
Yes, and I think it's also to underscore, we should underscore the United States' involvement in guaranteeing an oil supply to Israel during, what, the next 30 or 40 years, something like that.
Well, this guarantee, I hope that Israel will never be
Never need, yes.
To use, and if the day will come that will be in need of use of it, it will be a bad day to Israel and to the Israeli-American relations.
I'd like to go back to the PLO question and your reaction to a few things in the past few months. Your reaction to the visit of the noted black American leader, Jesse Jackson, to the Middle East.
Well, I think that one has to understand the long-standing policies of Israel. We more than welcome visits by individuals, groups of individuals to Israel alone, to Israel in the context of an overall Middle Eastern visit, as long as the purpose is to study, to learn, and it doesn't matter what are their opinions. But we have always followed two principles. That first, the main responsibility for the peacemaking process lies with the parties to the conflict.
Lies with what?
With the parties to the conflict, the Arab countries and Israel. No one can substitute them in the peacemaking process. Second, we welcome support of sovereign states, international organizations. In 1973, for example, the leaders of 5 black African states, the presidents of Nigeria, Ivory Coast, Senegal, Zaire, Gabon, formed a mission. They wanted to serve as mediators. We more than welcomed them. But we have never accepted that individuals, regardless how important he will be, can serve, can interject himself to be a mediator. The first precedent for such a policy was established 9 years ago when a very prominent Jewish leader, a president of the World Zionist Organization, Dr. Nahum Goldman, wanted to serve as a mediator between President Nasser and Prime Minister Golda Meir. Golda Meir said to him clearly and bluntly, "Stay where you are. We don't need your services." This policy was adopted on the second case, not exactly on the second case, there were others that tried, with Reverend Jesse Jackson. If he would like to come to Israel to visit, he will be more than welcome.
Hypothetically, if Arafat and the PLO were to denounce terrorism and formally call a halt to terrorist activities, would that be the entree, would that be the open door for you to be able to, or a representative of your government to be able to sit down with a representative of the PLO?
Well, if they'll do it, it will be a good sign, but I don't believe that the main issue is the basic problem with the PLO is that its philosophy and policy calls for the dismantling of Israel. There were many rumors, but just a few days ago, the one who is considered to be the foreign minister of the PLO, Farouk Kaddoumi, made it very clear that they had no intention whatsoever to recognize Israel. They can't do it. It's contradictory to what they stand for. If they'll do it, there will be no more PLO.
All right. Let's take a break and continue right after this. Yitzhak Rabin is our special guest today on Midday, and I would like to, in the time we have remaining, review with you some excerpts from an interview that was done with Moshe Dayan. It was in this past Sunday, a week's New York Times. Israel must keep forces in the Gaza Strip and West Bank only for defense, not to interfere in the lives of the Palestinians.
I don't believe that we have interfered in the past with the lives of the Palestinians. Dayan was, as a Minister of Defense, responsible for the military government between 67 till 74. I don't believe that we use the military force, or we use them now, to interfere with the lives of the Palestinians. Right. It is done only for security purposes. When I say security purposes, I mean twofold. For the defense of Israel, to prevent infiltration through the lines, which is very limited, and against terrorism that is originated from within.
All right. We should start by pulling out our military forces, unless, of course, the PLO would take over, then we would come back with a stronger force.
Well, to the best of my knowledge, I'm not aware that Dayan is for the withdrawal of the Israeli forces from the West Bank. Right. He is for withdrawing them from the main towns. I believe that we'll see this might happen, but not now. I think today to do it, it will not be advisable. We might do it towards the end of the year if, unfortunately, agreement will not be reached between Egypt and Israel about the creation of autonomy. I think then Israel will have to have some gestures in our pocket to offer to make it possible to proceed with the negotiations.
This is a further incentive. Moshe Dayan says, Jerusalem must not be partitioned, a Jewish quarter here, an Arab one there. They must be mixed with one another.
I believe it's a beautiful formula, and I think it is practiced today. I think mainly thanks to the capabilities and the way that the mayor of Jerusalem, Teddy Kollek, operates in Jerusalem in the last 12 years. And the fact that in the last elections, there were more Palestinians that participated in the elections than they participated during the Jordanian regime. Because under Israel, they know that their vote counts, while under the king's regime or under any Arab country's regime, there are no voting.
Was there anything that Moshe Dayan said in his rather lengthy interview about his formula for peace in the Middle East that you found very disappointing with regard to his view?
No.
Or impractical, or just something that you would firmly disagree with?
I believe that the basic difference between Dayan, Begin, Weizmann, and the way that I see it is by their reluctance to see under any circumstances some foreign sovereignty, Arab sovereignty, even over certain parts of the West Bank, while I and the Labour Party are ready to make these concessions if it will bring about peace and if it will not mean total withdrawal and redivision of Jerusalem.
What is the fulcrum then of the difference between the way you see it and the way they see it? What do you see differently?
Oh, basically differently, because they are not ready for giving back any parts of the West Bank, and we are ready to make this sacrifice for the sake of peace.
What kind of scenario do you see within the next year evolving?
We have got a very famous saying that even though in accordance to the Bible all the prophets came from that part of the world, it's not advisable anymore to become a prophet. What will happen in that part of the world? But I believe that the most dramatic event in the interrelations between the Arab countries and Israel for the good has taken place. The key Arab country and Egypt and Israel are in the process of building peace between themselves. They don't build it as separate peace. It's as a cornerstone for expanding the peacemaking process to the other sectors of the Arab-Israeli conflict. I believe by itself it's an historic development. Let's hope that we'll succeed in the coming years to bring about comprehensive peace.
Well, I will close this interview on that note. And I thank you very much, Mr. Prime Minister. His book is The Rabin Memoirs by Yitzhak Rabin. I thank you for being here. The next part of the show you're about to see was taped yesterday afternoon prior to this part being taped. So I ask you to stay with us for that, and I thank you very much.
Thank you.